In class, we've discussed how air gets heated and it cools off and it can rise and sink within the atmosphere. And so today, as we discuss air masses, we'll talk about large areas that has similar temperature and humidity. And we'll figure out how to classify these different types of air, and how they interact will help us understand how different types of weather forms. And we'll learn a little bit about that later on. So today we'll just get the basics, make sure we have a foundation of understanding before we move on. So differences in air pressure are caused because the Earth's surface is heated unevenly. And the question here is posed, why is Earth heated unevenly? And I've included this picture on the right just to remind us of what we've talked about in class, and how I've shown a flashlight on the side of a sphere to show how the light is distributed differently based on the fact that the sphere has a curved surface instead of a flat surface. So the same reason applies to the Earth. You can see in this picture that the sun's rays are shining on the Earth at different angles. So here is where the sunlight is striking most directly. You get the most intense light there. But closer to the poles, you end up having a low angle of incoming sunlight because you're getting to the part that is curving away from the light. So that would be why the Earth is heated unevenly. The equator ends up receiving more energy than the poles, so that causes a rising low pressure center, because remember, heat rises, so that heat ends up coming out that way. The cold air at the poles ends up sinking because cold air is more dense, and it creates a high pressure center. More dense means that the molecules are packed in more tightly, and it causes more pressure, which is why it would sink. So air moves from areas of high pressure to low pressure. They want to have places so they can spread out and move, just the way we are when we're in a crowd. Generally, air moves from the poles toward the equator on the surface level, as this picture demonstrates on the left. So 3 things that affect the way the air moves on the Earth as it spins on its axis is temperature of the air, pressure differences within the air, and then the Coriolis effect. Remember, we talked about in class that the Coriolis effect is not the cause of wind, but it simply changes the direction the wind blows because of the Earth's rotation. So sometimes there's little difference in air pressure between different spaces or regions of air, and so the air remains relatively still. There's not a whole lot of wind. Another word for that is stationary. A large body of air throughout which there's the same type of temperature and same type of moisture or humidity, that's called an air mass. So it has to have those things in common. An air mass that forms over polar regions, so areas closer to the North and the South Pole, are typically going to be cold and they'll be dry. Air masses that form over tropical oceans, so the areas of moisture that are closer to the equator, are going to be more warm and more moist. One thing that helps us determine how to classify air masses is the source region. A source region means where does the air come from. 2 other things that help us classify air masses would be the temperature of the air and the overall humidity of the air. When I talk about humidity here in Virginia, I think we all know, especially during the summer, what it feels like to have a humid day outside. So there are 4 different words that we'll use to describe air masses, and we can use them in different combinations, and we'll talk about that in a minute. If I have a cold air mass source region, it's called polar. So again, it comes from the poles. If I have a warm air mass, the source region is typically from the tropical areas. The mass forming over land itself would be continental. You can think about it when you look at the globe here in this picture. You see the continents. So if it's forming over the continents, that's where we get the word. And finally, the mass forming over oceans is called maritime. I think of those 4 words, maritime would be the most unfamiliar to you. And so I just wanted to take a second to break down the word and just point out the root word here, M-A-R. If you take a Spanish class, you would learn eventually that the word mar means sea or ocean. I can't really remember. Regardless, it means a large body of water. And if you've heard of the job somebody has that's called a marine biologist, those are people that work with plants and animals that live in the water. So that's just to help you out in remembering what that word means, because I know sometimes it helps just to break down the word and see what the roots are. So we said in class that sometimes it might be easier to check for listening if we have questions to fill out along with the notes. So this section I'm not actually going to write on the screen just to make sure that we are paying attention. So we're going to fill in this middle column together. And the source region is continental, so that means the air mass comes from the continent. And if we were to write this on a map, instead of writing out the whole word continental, we would just write a lowercase c as a symbol. And remember, the type of air that we have coming from the continent would be dry. For maritime, if we were to write this on a map, we'd use the lowercase m as the symbol. And the type of air that comes from the maritime air mass is moist. For the tropical source region, the air that comes from the tropics is going to be written with a capital T on a map, and that type of air is warm. Finally, the polar source region sends air masses to different places that are cold, and the symbol you would use for that is a capital P. So the continental air mass has low humidity, which is really nice in the summer, and it brings a dry weather condition. So there are two types of continental air masses. One is polar, which means you would experience cold and dry weather, and then a continental tropical air mass brings warm and dry weather. This is not something we really experience a whole lot in the summer, as you may know from being outside here in Virginia. A maritime air mass brings higher humidity, and with it comes fog and precipitation. Two types of air masses that come from the ocean are maritime polar, which means it's coming from the poles, and so it would be moist air, but it's cold. And maritime tropical air masses bring moist and warm weather. As you can see on one of the slides before, air masses are all over the world, but because we live in North America, we're going to focus on 6 locations that affect those air masses. An air mass usually brings weather of its source location, but as it moves away from its source, it could change depending on the location it goes to. So a tropical air mass that affects the United States, there are 2 of them. The continental ones form over the deserts in the southwest. So typically that would be around Arizona and New Mexico. Those places typically experience a dry, hot weather in summer, and these air masses don't really form very much in the winter. The maritime tropical air mass forms over warm water of the tropical Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, and the Gulf of Mexico. This brings mild and cloudy weather to the eastern United States in the winter. So this is something we experience. It doesn't get quite as cold in the winter where we live as it does other places in our country. And it also brings really hot, humid weather and thunderstorms in summer. And I think we can all agree we've experienced that here. A polar air mass that affects the United States, the continental one, forms over ice and snow-covered land up in Canada. And it brings cool and dry weather in the summer and very cold weather in the northern U.S. in the winter. So this doesn't typically affect us a whole lot, but sometimes it can reach down as far as the Gulf Coast. The maritime polar air mass would form over the North Pacific Ocean, so closer to Washington and Oregon. Rain and snow come to the Pacific coast in the winter, and it brings cool and foggy weather in the summer. I had some friends that traveled to California in the summer, and they bragged about how cool it was at night, and they were experiencing temperatures where they had to wear sweatshirts or long sleeve shirts at night because it got pretty chilly outside. It's pretty jealous considering how hot it gets over here in Virginia. This final data table we need to fill out together as you listen. I'm not going to fill this in once again just to make sure that we're listening to the videos as well as watching. So this first row discusses the source location and the movement of the air mass, and it brings cold and dry weather. This means this air mass would be considered a continental polar air mass. The second row tells that it comes from the poles. It moves southeast and southwest, and it brings cold and moist weather. This means that it would be considered a maritime polar air mass. The third row, it comes from the southwest of the United States, bringing warm and dry weather. This would be considered a continental tropical air mass. And then the final one comes from the tropics, moves northeast, it brings warm and moist air, so this would be a maritime tropical air mass. Please make sure that any questions that you have, you write them down somewhere on the notes, or if there's confusion about any of the slides, you make a note of it so that we can discuss it in class and clear up anything that you don't understand. I'll see you in class tomorrow.